So how do you make sense of a huge global trade deal when you hear one side calling it, the biggest ever, while the other calls it a dark day? It's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it? Well, today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that puzzle, the new U.S. EU trade agreement, the one announced July 28, 2025. Our mission here is really to get past those headlines. We're going to unpack this thing layer by layer using all the source material you've given us. We'll pull out the vital insights, boil down the facts, sift through those conflicting viewpoints, and the goal, to give you everything you need, the facts, the perspectives, to condense all this information into a really punchy, effective 90-second news hook. That's the challenge you set for us today.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, how those completely different takes can shape how everyone sees the same event. It's exactly why we need to look beyond the sound bites, really grasp the nuances from every angle. So in this deep dive, we'll systematically go through the core parts of the deal. We'll look at the big financial commitments and break down how specific sectors are affected. By the end, you should have this comprehensive, sort of multi-sided view you need to craft that perfect news hook, one that really reflects the complexity, maybe even the contradictions here.
Okay, let's start right there with that dramatic difference in perception. You had President Trump on the U.S. side immediately saying this is the biggest deal ever made, framing it as this fundamental rebalancing between the world's two biggest economies.
Right, a massive claim.
But then over in Europe, leaders like French Prime Minister François Bayrou, well, that didn't hold back, calling it a dark day for Europe, arguing it's heavily tilted against EU interests. I mean, that's a huge gap. Is someone misunderstanding it? Or is it just spin? What's really going on to create such different views?
Well, if you look at the bigger picture, this rebalancing really means a significant shift in how tariffs work and how money flows between the U.S. and EU. It's fundamentally about who pays what and how much. Simple as that, but incredibly complex in practice. The gains one side celebrates often mean direct costs, or let's say strategic compromises for the other. Reconciling those statements means digging into the specifics, the actual measurable gains and losses for each side, and how they see those against their own goals. It really shows how political talk can stray pretty far from the economic facts on the ground, and that's a key point for your news hook, I think.
Okay, let's get right into those tariff specifics then, because that's where the money is actually changing hands. So the deal says the EU agreed to put a 15% import tariff on most of its exports going to the U.S. And that's not minor stuff. It covers huge sectors: cars, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors.
Right. And that 15%, just to put it in context, it's way higher than the historical average. That was only around 1.4% before the Trump administration started shaking things up.
Exactly. But it's also a lot lower than the really aggressive tariffs President Trump had threatened before, like 30% or even 50%.
True. So it's a compromise figure, you could say.
Yeah.
But still, a very substantial shift for European companies selling into the U.S., a big financial hit.
And this 15% tariff, the idea is it generates significant revenue for the U.S. Treasury, right? Yeah. Tens of billions a year, potentially.
That's the projection, yes. Tens of billions annually. And the flip side is U.S. tariffs on goods going into the EU are set to drop dramatically. The expectation is the average tariff the EU charges on U.S. goods will fall below 1%.
Just 1%.
Which the White House is obviously framing as unprecedented market access for American products in Europe.
Essentially, yeah. It should make it much easier, much cheaper for U.S. companies to sell their goods over there. It changes the playing field in Europe, definitely in favor of U.S. exporters.
But, okay, it's not just one flat change across the board. There are these really interesting exceptions, like those really high 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper. Those stay put, unchanged. Still very high, affecting specific industries quite heavily.
And then, conversely, they agreed on zero-for-zero tariffs for some things, no duties at all. That includes aircraft and parts, some chemicals, certain farm products, and critical raw materials.
Exactly.
So when you look deeper, it's not one size fits all. Different sectors get treated very differently. What does that tell us? And how does that complicate things for you trying to craft one clear story?
Well, it really underscores how complex, how segmented this agreement is. You've got clear winners and losers baked right in. Take the German auto industry. They're widely expected to be among the hardest hit. That 15% car tariff, even though it's lower than the worst-case threats, it's still way above what they were paying.
Could cost them billions a year, right?
Potentially, yes. Billions annually. They'll likely have to rethink their supply chains, their U.S. pricing. It's a major headache for them. But then you look at aerospace. U.S. and EU manufacturers in that space, they're seen as potential winners because they fall into that zero-for-zero group.
So a big trade barrier just vanishes for them.
Exactly. So it really is a mixed bag. Understanding those contrasts is, I think, crucial for making your news hook accurate and compelling.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit.
Yeah.
A huge part of this deal, maybe the most ambitious, involves these massive financial commitments from the EU side to the U.S. The EU has pledged to buy, get this, $750 billion worth of U.S. energy exports.
Wow.
Yeah. Oil, gas, nuclear fuel, even semiconductors apparently fall under this. And the deadline is 2028. The stated goal is boosting U.S. energy dominance and cutting Europe's reliance on what they call adversarial sources. Read Russia, mostly.
Okay, $750 billion by 2028. That's huge. And there's more, right?
Yep. Beyond energy, the EU also committed to making $600 billion in new investments in the United States, again by 2028.
Okay.
And on top of that, the agreement mentions the EU buying significant amounts of U.S. military gear, though the exact value isn't specified there.
So energy purchases, direct investment, military sales, these are enormous figures. It sounds incredibly beneficial for the U.S. economy on the surface.
It does. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, especially for your news hook, you need to look closer at the details. Analysts have flagged some key nuances.
Like what?
Well, for instance, EU officials apparently clarified that the $600 billion investment number, that reflects corporate intentions, not binding government commitments.
Ah, okay. That's a pretty important difference. Intentions versus guarantees.
Huge difference, right? And then there's the energy commitment, $750 billion by 2028. Consider this. Last year, the EU total energy imports from the U.S. were only about $80 billion.
$80 billion, compared to a target of $750 billion.
Exactly. So you're talking about nearly a tenfold increase in just a few years.
Yeah.
It definitely raises questions about how realistic that target is. Is it feasible?
That nuance, the corporate intentions thing, it's not just some technical point, is it? It speaks volumes about how solid this deal might be in the long run. If it's mostly down to companies deciding to invest rather than governments being on the hook, that puts a lot of market risk back onto the U.S. side, hoping those investments materialize.
Right.
It makes you question how much actual leverage these commitments provide. Are they really anchoring this rebalance relationship, or are they more about, political signaling, aspirational goals?
And for your news hook, telling the difference between a firm promise and a lofty ambition is absolutely key for accuracy, isn't it?
Absolutely. It flags the potential gap between what's being announced and what might actually happen down the road. Big potential for discrepancy there.
Okay, moving beyond tariffs and those huge purchase numbers, the deal also gets into digital trade and these things called non-tariff barriers. That directly hits U.S. tech and agriculture. So the agreement sets up a process to remove unjustified barriers to digital trade. And critically, it stops those proposed network usage fees.
Ah, yes, the sender pays idea.
Exactly. That would have forced U.S. tech companies to basically pay subsidies to European telecom companies. American tech fought hard against that, and they won on this point.
And that's potentially a very big deal financially. I saw that the Computer and Communications Industry Association, the CCIA, they estimated existing EU digital rules were already costing U.S. firms, almost $100 billion a year.
Yeah, nearly $100 billion. One recent study, they did put the number right at $97.6 billion annually. So avoiding more costs like network fees is significant.
Definitely. And it wasn't just digital, right? Didn't it also try to cut red tape elsewhere?
It did. It maintained zero customs duties on electronic transmissions, things like software downloads or streaming. And it aims to streamline paperwork for U.S. exporters, specifically mentioning things like sanitary certificates for U.S. pork and dairy.
Okay, so practical, tangible benefits aimed at making it easier for U.S. firms to compete in Europe.
Right. But then there's a critical detail that emerged for one specific, very important sector, pharmaceuticals. The 15% tariff applied to EU-branded medicines. Analysts are calling that a $19 billion risk just for that sector alone.
$19 billion. Wow. And pharma was exempt before, wasn't it?
Historically, yes. Exempt from U.S. import duties. And the EU supplies a huge chunk, like 60% of U.S. drug imports by value. So this is a major shift.
And there's still uncertainty, too.
Yeah, big uncertainty. It's apparently unclear if generic drugs will get an exemption from this 15% tariff. Plus, looming over everything is a U.S. Section 232 investigation. That's one of those national security probes. It's due by August 2025.
And those can lead to really high tariffs, can't they?
Potentially, yes. Some fear it could lead to tariffs as high as 200% on pharmaceuticals. Imagine that. It creates massive volatility for a critical industry that affects everyone's healthcare costs as access.
So companies must be scrambling already. I mean, big players like Sanofi, Roche, they must be adapting.
Reports suggest they are. They're looking at diversifying manufacturing, maybe shifting more production, building up inventories inside the U.S. to reduce their risk exposure.
Which, interestingly, probably creates knock-on effects, right? Opportunities for contract research organizations, maybe generic drug makers who partner with U.S. firms.
Exactly. It forces strategic shifts across the board.
Yeah.
And if you connect that back to the big picture, it just highlights how deeply this deal cuts into specific industries. It demands more than just adjusting prices. It requires fundamental strategic changes.
And including that kind of specific industry impact could make your news hook much more concrete and relatable, I think.
Good point. Okay, finally, let's zoom out a bit to the broader implications. This whole thing is currently being described as a non-binding framework. What does that actually mean?
Well, it essentially means the headline agreement is there, but a lot of the detailed technical work still needs to be hammered out. And crucially, it still needs approval from all the individual EU member states.
So not quite a done deal yet.
Not entirely. Some experts are calling these more like political agreements. Strong on intent, maybe, but lighter on the technical specifics at this stage. And that leaves room for different interpretations, maybe even attempts to renegotiate parts of it later on.
Especially given how unhappy some in Europe, like Prime Minister Bayrou, seem to be. Getting all 27 EU members to sign off might be tricky. What does all that ambiguity mean for stability?
Well, it raises that big question. How durable is this deal really going to be? If it's not fully locked down and binding yet, we already see some negative economic forecasts. Those 15% tariffs are expected to trim euro area GDP growth by maybe 0.5%.
That's significant.
It is. And the euro slipped against the dollar right after the announcement, which some analysts, like those at Alliance Global Investors, interpreted as reflecting a weaker result for the EU.
So the perception of fairness, or lack thereof, could really impact whether it holds up long term.
Yes.
Especially getting member state approval.
Precisely. The politics within the EU could definitely influence its final form and its staying power. That non-binding nature is a key qualifier for your news hook. Is it a final pact or still a work in progress?
And then there's the even bigger context, stuff not directly in this deal, but hovering around it, like climate policy and trade.
Right. That's a huge area where the U.S. and EU have different approaches right now.
You've got the U.S. with its Inflation Reduction Act focusing on subsidies, green subsidies mainly, tax credits and incentives.
And the EU has its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which is basically a carbon tariff on imports.
Two quite different tools aimed at similar climate goals, but potentially leading to trade friction between them if they're not careful.
Exactly. So while it's not part of the specific deal we're dissecting, things like coordinating through climate clubs, groups of countries with similar climate policies, will be crucial to avoid future tensions. Why should you, our listener, care about that context for this deal's news hook?
Because it's a reminder, isn't it? This agreement, as big as it is, it's just one piece of a much larger, constantly shifting puzzle in the transatlantic economy. And importantly, the U.S. and EU also said they'd strengthen cooperation on economic security. Things like screening foreign investments, making supply chains more resilient.
Aimed at countering non-market practices from third countries, right? Exactly. Think state-owned enterprises, forced tech transfer, IP theft, things that distort fair trade. So even as they're trying to sort out their own trade relationship with this deal, they're also signaling a more united front against other global economic challenges.
It adds another layer, doesn't it? The future isn't just about U.S. EU tariffs. It's about how they position themselves together on the world stage.
Precisely. A strategic pivot happening alongside the trade adjustments.
Wow. Okay, what a deep dive that was. We've really peeled back the layers on this huge U.S.-EU trade deal, from those headline tariff numbers and the massive financial pledges down to the nitty-gritty impacts on digital trade, on pharmaceuticals, and the crucial difference between commitments and intentions.
And exploring that stark contrast between the political rhetoric, biggest deal ever versus dark day, and the underlying economic realities.
You should now have a really solid, comprehensive grasp of the facts, the different viewpoints, and the deeper currents shaping this agreement.
Absolutely. You've got all the essential ingredients now to put together that powerful 90-second news hook, something that captures the core conflict, the key numbers, and the real-world consequences for someone needing to get up to speed quickly and accurately.
So as you take all this in and start thinking about how to frame that hook, here's maybe one last thought to chew on. If this deal is seen so differently, like a win for one side, and maybe a necessary, if painful, compromise for the other, what does this whole transatlantic rebalancing really tell us about where global trade negotiations might be heading?
That's a great question. Are we moving towards deals that prioritize the immediate interests of the most powerful players?
Or will there still be space for more balanced multilateral approaches?
Yeah.
Ones that try to lift the broader global economy and build more lasting stability, rather than just shifting the balance of power, something to definitely think about.